Hello, my name is Nick Geeslin. I'm the grandson of the interviewee today and author of the novel Where is God's Hand, Dr. James Geeslin. The time is 10:10 Eastern. We're in Atlantic Beach, Florida. It's Saturday, the 27th, 2023, and we're happy to get it started. Dr. Geeslin, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is James Bernard Geeslin, M.D. Where's God's Hand is my first novel. It tells a story of a fictional young Southern doctor, but it is also a historical treatise on the 37th Alabama Infantry and its battles in the Western campaign of the Civil War from 1862 to 1865.
Well, I think we can get in a bit into that and your interest and motivation for writing about that particular part of the country's history.
One day I was looking through some genealogy material that my mother had given me many, many years ago, and I discovered that our forebear, Thomas John Northern, who was highly regarded in my family as the actually patriarch of my mother's family, had served in the 37th Alabama Infantry. So fortunately that there's a great deal of information about the 37th Alabama Infantry in the state archives, and there's been 2 books that have been written about it. So those were my sources. And so I'd always been fascinated by medicine during the Civil War. So that's how come the protagonist got to be a doctor.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned the state archives, and I was wondering about that, realizing how much research went into, making sure all the dates, I'm sure all the dates for the battles were.
There's a huge amount of information on the Civil War, even several books written on the day-to-day activities for the whole 4 years. So finding out about about what was going on with that regiment during a specific period was no problem, because it's well documented.
What about the medical practices? And
well, there's a lot of that too, and written about in a lot of different books. And I've all my whole life, from the time I was in high school, I've been interested in that. And of course, the main thing is that during that period of time, they practiced with no anesthesia, and they had really no antibiotics or any other kind of really basic medication. Although they did know some things that they knew from experience worked, like they knew that putting gunpowder in a wound would help with preventing infection, because gunpowder is made with sulfur, and sulfur is a great antibiotic.
Interesting. Well, maybe we can back up a bit from the details and talk about, because you mentioned your interest in Civil War history and medical practices during that time. You mentioned your motivation to write about the era, or share a bit about the era because of your forebears. But what motivated you to specifically to write rather than just to research?
Well, I read so many books, I thought I could write one. So that's the reason why I did.
Okay. What do you think, besides reading books, is there anything that prepared you for writing? You think?
No.
Just
no, that was the hard part, actually, making sure that you had all the grammar right and everything. But my schooling was very productive and helpful in that department.
Well, I think we can go back to the book. The title, Where is God's Hand? I think is a theme throughout the book, right? The existence or extent of divine intervention in one's life. And is this something you wonder about often?
Oh, yes. No, yes, that's very true. And those certainly people of that era must have wondered about it a lot of times, because they were a lot more religious than we are in this day and time. And only natural that they would wonder what was going on.
Well, I think it certainly adds it's a theme that you return to it often enough, but not too often throughout the book. And I think it's an interesting thing to lay on top of.
Well, it is something that would come up a lot of times for a soldier who was witnessing a huge amount of chaos and death. And in the Civil War, of course, the battle tactics were quite primitive, and there was a large amount of useless and needless death because of the battle tactics.
Interesting. I think I'll jump around here because I think, you know, that is an interesting comment, because I think something that I got out of the book that I'm sure other readers did as well is what life was like. I mean, not many of us have, or very few of us have a connection to the Civil War, especially one that's beyond an academic connection. And what this did for me, having read someone's work who clearly did a lot of research and thinking about what life was like during the Civil War, I really enjoyed that insight into what it was like, not only during the war, but also months leading up to it and the years after it. Is there something that you wanted readers to get out of the experience of the book, besides just the entertainment of it? Like insight into the life of a Civil War soldier? Or
well, yes, of course, we wanted to make sure that the protagonist and his life was a reflection of what was going on at that period of time, both in the fields of his early life, his schooling, and then his activities during the war as a physician and as an infantry officer.
Okay. Let's talk about, and this is something we've touched on briefly, but I wonder what you could tell us about any of your family history or our family history that's woven into the novel. Any examples that you'd like to share?
Dr. Northern appears in the story as a young Confederate soldier. And as I had mentioned before, he was the actual paternal ancestor that my mother's family was quite concerned with. So that he was always talked about at our house as I was growing up, because the reader will maybe not know that I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where the Battle of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge took place. And of course, I was continually enmeshed in that as I was growing up. And Dr. Northern was actually wounded at Missionary Ridge, and my mother knew exactly where it was that it happened, and she took us there many times.
Interesting. Yeah, I recall that. I mean, in my limited understanding of Civil War history, I understand that that's a very significant occasion, the battle on Missionary Ridge, right? And maybe it's for that reason, maybe it's because you grew up there and learned a lot about the history of that particular battle. But I recall that part of the book, there's a lot of good imagery about whose farm one company is stowing away at, where exactly the line is. And
well, actually, if you go to those battlefields, particularly on Missionary Ridge, you can go and stand right in the line, because it's well marked where each one of the units had their cannons placed and had their trenches dug and everything like that. The interesting thing about that battle for Chattanooga is that the part that happened on Lookout Mountain gets the most history, but the part about Missionary Ridge is the most important.
Any other examples of family history woven into the novel, whether inspiration or specific names or events?
Well, not really. Both my progenitors, my mother's grandfather, Dr. Northern, and my father's grandfather, Nicholas Geeslin, were Civil War veterans, which makes me a son of the Confederacy. So I was interested in that part of it.
Okay. The names of other folks that you haven't mentioned throughout the novel, there's lots of them, and I was wondering and struggling to find too much in the way of research when I looked up the occasional name, whether any of those folks were real and you took those from your studies of the archives.
Well, if it had to do with the 37th Alabama Infantry, they're all real people. The commander of the 37th Alabama Regiment, Colonel Dowdle, was a real person. And in an area known as Pine Mountain, Georgia, there's a hill called Dowdle's Knob, which is named after him.
What about the ships? The names of the ships? Were those real ships or
no?
Okay.
No, I made that. Most of the part about the discovery of the gold and the treasure hunting in the Caribbean was based on my other reading. However, what fascinated me about that was the diving part. And I had no idea that diving was so far advanced during that period of time. But the diving helmets were quite well advanced at that particular time. And that's all real.
Yeah, that was a fascinating piece of the book, and it took an interesting and turn while still maintaining, I think, the development of each of the characters, the main characters at least, and continued the thread of what the Reconstruction was like in the South and so forth. But yeah, was there? So you mentioned other studies that you had done of the time and so forth. Is that more? I mean, I imagine that's not specifically treasure hunting, more so just how life was like.
Well, if you're a student of the Civil War, even thereafter, there are large amounts of gold that's missing everywhere about the Civil War. So you can read it. And I made most of that up, but it's based on the fact that it could have been true because there is so much gold missing from the Confederate treasury.
And is that the result of, obviously it's missing, no one knows exactly what happened to it, but is it
because they were moving it around and it just got lost in the moving around?
Whether bandits or sunken ships,
probably wound up in somebody's pocket.
Right, people saw the writing on the wall. Why Alabama is the birthplace and
because
probably...
my mother was born in what's the name of that town? Ashland, Alabama, right? And everything that happened while she was growing up, and even when we lived in LaGrange, Georgia, which is very close to Ashland, Alabama, was important in those two counties right around there.
So imagine the size of the town, the general makeup, although maybe not the names of the shops and so forth. All of that's true.
Interesting thing about that is I could not find anywhere the name of the main street in Ashland, Alabama. I did huge amounts of research. I even called my cousin who still lives in LaGrange and who frequently visited over there to find out what the name of the main street was, but she never could find out.
Huh. Interesting. So the weaponry is clearly, I think your interest in weaponry and the advances that were being made throughout the Civil War is clearly represented in an interesting piece of the novel. I wonder if you have anything to mention about that.
Well, that's all true. I've always been fascinated with Lamat pistols, which was a 6-shot revolver with a shotgun barrel as a 7th shot. And that occurs in several places and is given to Moses, Lee Campbell's faithful retainer, to use, and he does. And Hall carbines, which was probably the most effective long arm of the Civil War, was in there.
And all of the other events, dates, movements of at least of the company and the general movements of the.
It's all exactly right and all well documented. So I didn't have to make up any of that.
What about maybe going back to the process? We can talk a little bit about the process of writing the book. What percentage of, and then maybe we can include some of the research that you did as well as the editing, in addition to the writing. What percentage of your time do you think you spent writing versus researching versus?
About 60-40, 60% writing and 40% research. And my granddaughter, Margaret, helped me quite a bit to transcribe the handwritten part onto a computer. And my daughter, Jo, was a great editor. And she did most of the editing as far as the grammar and everything was concerned, so that when we sent it to the printer, it was ready to print.
All right.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to share about your process, how long it took?
I think the book was written in about 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Impressive.
I wrote every day. I like to write 2 hours in the morning every day. And that has not been so easy with the second book, which is only about a third finished.
Okay. Well, I'll be interested to ask about that. I have a few questions about that, but before we do, some questions came in from other readers that I'd like to share. And one of them is a fun one. Of all the, oh, sorry, I'll ask those later. I think we'll go back to the characters when you talk a little bit about the main characters a little bit and what your inspiration for them was and what you see as motivations for them. And we can start with Lee, I think. Was there any inspiration that you used for the character of Lee?
No, just what I thought that I would like to have been like if I lived in that particular time. And as you may have gotten from the book, Lee has exceptional qualities. He's a synesthete, and he's able to see aura around people and know a little bit about their activities and whether they're honest or not honest. And he's a little bit stronger than the average person, a little bit quicker than the average person, and a little bit smarter than the average person, which I always hoped I would be, but I'm not.
I have a sense that that's a universal feeling. Right. So Lee, I'm interested in Lee the gambler because I think that's an interesting piece of his character, and I wonder what drove you to make that a part of his character.
Well, frankly, I had read about that in other books about gamblers that had that capacity to be able to see when the cards were always going to be in their favor and when poker was, or when even the roulette balls were going to fall on the right numbers. There is a Russian author named Boris Akunin who writes a lot, and his character is able to do that. And that's where that inspiration came from.
Okay. Tell me about Moses and your inspiration for the character of Moses.
Well, it was a book written during the time of slavery, but I didn't want to write anything about slavery. So I don't have any idea if people like Moses ever came about, but it seemed quite possible. So, and people were not as apt to judge back in those days. So the fact that he was a foundling, but raised by a white family, and he was neither a slave nor a free man. So his status was unknown, but yet nobody would ever challenge it because he came from such a good family.
Interesting. Another reader question here. Do you have any further explanation for Moses's sort of, you mentioned Lee's kind of sixth sense abilities, and I feel like Moses displayed some similar sort of capabilities.
Well, Moses, of course, was very smart, and sometimes he could figure out things that Lee could not figure out. And that was very important. Particularly, he was very adept at knowing what the enemy was going to do. And Lee was not so adept at that.
Meaning it's more of a matter of strategic versus intuitive.
Moses was very adept at knowing what the Union forces and the Union commanders were thinking about doing before they ever did it, which was one of the great failures of the Confederate command structure. They couldn't figure that out.
Last character that I'll ask about, and then I'll let you talk about any characters that you feel like the listeners would be interested in hearing about. But someone that not, I would say, a main character, but one that I found very interesting was Robinette, the captain. And I wonder what your inspiration for.
Well, I guess he's a combination of sea captains that I've read about. At one point in my life, I was very interested in seagoing in that particular era, and in the 100 years before that. So he was kind of a combination of that, and very interesting ships during that period of time, because steam power and sail power was being made and used on the same ship at that time. And there were many ships available after the war, which the Navy couldn't use and they couldn't sell. So that's how come Robinette was able to get the second ship.
Right. I imagine that was an enjoyable part of the book to write, it being that you didn't have to so neatly fit all of the different movements.
No, that's entirely made up. Like I like to say, everything in the book is true except for the part I made up.
Was there a piece of the book that you felt like was the most enjoyable to write? Or was it all sort of a seamless experience of?
No, I liked it all. But the second part, when they were in Haiti, I enjoyed writing and learning about the voodoo history.
That's a good thread that we can follow. Because I think it was an interesting addition to the plot, but not one that was necessary maybe for the furthering. So I wonder what your interest, what sparked your interest in voodoo as
just needed something for him to be doing when they were there.
Okay. I enjoyed that. Okay, so some other questions from readers. Of all the foods described, especially in the New Orleans scenes, including the post-treasure dinner, for post-treasure find dinner, do you have a favorite dish that you described? I think you described them pretty.
Well, I've always been quite fond of crab meat stuffed redfish, which was part of their dinner. And of course, every meal in New Orleans in that day and time started with raw oysters. And so it's another one of my favorites.
Okay. So are there any other characters you'd like to mention and talk about?
Well, there's one soldier in there who was shot in the buttocks, and he's modeled after my roommate in medical school, who was a great anatomist and is known for the area between two buttocks, which is called Gotten's Cleft. And that comes out in the book.
Okay, gotcha. How would you say this, your debut novel, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about the sequel too here. How would you say your writing plays into what you'd like to leave behind as your legacy? Is that something you think about?
Not something I think about.
Okay. Well, any ideas how many copies have sold of book number 1?
33 copies.
Okay, excellent. Has it been translated into any foreign languages yet?
Not yet. It could be done. The publisher will do all that for you, and the publisher will merchandise it, which is something I haven't done, but that's kind of as expensive. So I haven't done it. I could do more of it myself. I mean, I could take it to the local bookshops and they would be happy to put it on display and do book signings and all that stuff. And it has been noted in my high school and college monthly magazines. So when those are published, maybe it'll sell some more.
What about the sequel?
Well, the sequel again uses Lee Campbell, who has now been elected to the Senate and is also involved with missing gold. And that's about as far as it's gotten so far.
Okay. Do you have any ideas about release date?
No, it's not. It's only about a third written.
Okay.
And I haven't been very good about writing lately.
That's okay. It happens.
I'm waiting on Chat GPT so I can learn some more about what might have gone on with the lost gold.
So you have questions that otherwise you'd have to sift through archives and so forth that
you don't know exactly where to look for that.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else about the novel that you'd like to share here?
No, not really. I just hope that people enjoy reading it. And apparently everybody that has read it has enjoyed it. It's not very deep, but if you read the reviews on Amazon, people do enjoy the historical part. And that's all that really makes a difference, is that they enjoy reading it.
Yeah. I think in addition to the insight that I mentioned into how life was like then, which I think everyone would benefit from, not having a direct connection to that era, I think the pace of the book is really nice, and there's a lot of good shifts in the setting and the characters and so forth. So I think it's entertaining.
Well, you try to make it move along, and that's important. I mean, you can get bogged down in writing about certain things, and that the average reader is not interested in that.
Right. Agreed. Is there anyone else besides your granddaughter Margaret that you'd like to thank, and your daughter Jo, throughout the process?
Well, of course, my dear wife, Ann, she was very supportive, and she would come and look every day to see if I was working on it, and that was very helpful.
Sounds like we could still be waiting for it if not for those 3 individuals. Well, thanks so much for the time.
Well, thank you for your interest.
Of course.
Yeah.
It was a joy, and we're all looking forward to the sequel.
And this is probably going to appear on your blog, and probably also going to appear on your podcast. So we'll all be looking forward to it.
Okay.